Hi, this is Marci Eberhardt, and for my video presentation for my studio project, I have selected watercolor medium and a review of the elements of art for ARE 5046. As we review or re-review the elements of art, particularly space, shape, and form, we're going to be learning more about watercolor medium. The fluidity and transparency of watercolor are unique, but these are the very qualities that have given the medium a reputation for being difficult. Because the paint is transparent, you can't correct mistakes by overpainting as you would with opaque paints. In fact, watercolor is no more difficult than the other medium, but like all painting, it takes practice and willingness to experiment and be patient with yourself and give yourself time for learning. As a teacher, it's my responsibility to make sure that I incorporate the content standards for the grades that I'm teaching. The Align Florida standards for this lesson are as follows. This vetted resource aligns to concepts or skills in these standards. The first one, VA68, make connections between the structural elements of art and the organization principles of design to understand how artwork is unified. The second bullet point, VA 912, use the structural elements of art and the organizational principles of design works of art to establish an interpretive and technical foundation for visual coherence. Okay, a quick review of the elements of art: line, shape, form, color, value, texture, and space. As most of you know, getting a sketchbook and carrying that around with you to brainstorm ideas gives you the ability to improve your drawing, but not only that, it gives you a chance to brainstorm ideas for new art projects. And if you can draw, you can paint, or at least that's my theory. This is the way I've set my watercolor palette up, and you can see in the middle I use that for mixing colors together. Sometimes you may feel drawn to a subject because of a certain atmosphere about it. Atmosphere is an important quality to communicate in your paintings, and to do so you need to choose your colors carefully. There's an artist saying that states, you can't make a good drawing unless you have shadows or incorporate shadows, at least not a good one. So we get back to line, shape, and form, which is really the basis of sketching. We need to know the elements of art before we start any project, and moreover, before we start watercolor painting. Here's a box full of erasers and different types of pencils, including Conti pencils, ebony pencils for shading, 4B, HB, so different hardnesses of pencils for different effects. Also have a nice brush in here for brushing off eraser stubble when you don't want to run your hand through what you've drawn and risk tarnishing the paper or creating unwanted shadows. Paper comes in 3 different types: cold press, heat press, and rough. In school, we generally use cold press, 140-pound cold press. It's pretty common, and it's reasonably inexpensive. And I try to use the medium grade or the Artist Loft 2 from Michaels. So far, it's my favorite. It's the easiest to scrub out any kind of, make any corrections or variations or creating highlights. It takes wash variations real well too, and creating puddles and mingling colors. Gianna Smith is one of my top art students, and today she's taking on the task of illustrating and painting in watercolor the iceberg on her left. Here's a side-by-side view of Gianna's finished product on the right. And like I say, voila, an iceberg by Gianna Smith. Masking fluid is applied with a brush. The marks made with it can be just as expressive, but it's used in a way that it leaves the white area of a watercolor painting white, and you can paint over it without risking going into that white area with color. Or you, instead of using the latex, you can paint around an area to leave that white, but it is more difficult. And then when the fluid's dry, you just peel it off and you have a nice white area that you intended to leave white in the first place. Okay, the very first step with the French ultramarine blue in the upper left-hand corner. I put that there so we could do a little scrubbing and you can see what that actually does. Blue is one of the most difficult colors to scrub out, or say you made a mistake and you don't want that color in there, or you want to mix it with an alizarin crimson and create a purple. At any rate, to scrub that out, you're using a boarhead bristled brush, and you're going back and forth, picking that paint up, dipping it in the water in between, drying it off, blotting it, and coming in and scrubbing. See, you can start to see the scrubbing on the left-hand side. This is pretty wet. I would have let this dry a little more thoroughly before I went in to scrub it. I prefer to scrub on dry paint, but for this demo, I don't have overnight to wait for it to dry and re-demonstrate this. But you can see where the paint's lifting with the use of this boar bristle fan brush. Okay, and with the wax, this is a liquid wax that repels water-based products. I'm going to use the dropper and drop some right next to where I put the masking fluid. Okay, so I've laid some masking fluid out with the popsicle stick. That'll go in the trash in just a few minutes. Latex is really gooey and it'll stick to anything, so I want to keep it out of harm's way. Okay, for wet on dry, I'll take that same mop brush, or just about any brush you can think of that you're comfortable using with watercolor. And I'm drying that out, but not bone dry, it's still slightly damp. And I'm going to pick up some alizarin crimson and go right underneath that same area that I just did wet on wet. And I'm applying a dry brush with color to dry 140 cold press. And what that does is it just barely touches the top of the tooth of the 140 cold press, and it creates texture and interest from dark to light. Okay, the next thing I'm going to demo is the salt. I have the salt shaker here, and we'll just pretend that this tree needs some texture. So we go in and we sprinkle some table salt on it, and you can see that it begins to create texture. In between my fingers I have coarse salt, and we'll pick another area for the coarse salt, and that'll leave bigger textured areas or larger textured areas in the wet on wet. Next, we're going to do alcohol on 140 cold press. This is one of my favorite techniques. I use it often in my mixed media. So we're just going to grab the bottle of alcohol and spray the paper. Let it sit for a minute. Grab my mop brush, and it should be moderately wet, not soaking wet. Find a color I want to use. Let's go into some red. And I'm going to dab that red in here where I sprayed the alcohol ink, and it repels, the red repels away from the paper. It creates really interesting effects, similarly to wet on dry and coarse salt in wet on dry, or wet on wet. So don't throw away those scrap pieces of plastic, bubble wrap, or cling wrap, because you can incorporate those into wet paint, into your watercolor. You press it down into the paint and leave it for a few minutes and then remove it, and it leaves a real nice texture that often lends a lot of light through the darker areas and creates a rippling effect. Okay, next we're going to grab a piece of the cling wrap that I ripped off. I've put a puddle of French ultramarine blue in the center of the 140 cold press, and it is on dry, and I'm going to set that cling wrap right onto that dab or puddle of French ultramarine blue and give it 5 or 10 minutes, which we will do so, and you'll see what sort of an effect that creates. Here's the bucket for my water that I've had for right around 15 years, and I don't plan on trading it in anytime soon. I love the two different compartments where I can use the grid on the bottom of the larger section to really get in and wash my paintbrushes. And then the other area at the top here, the smaller area, is for clean water. I've also included a water dropper that I don't really use for water. I use it more for applying waxes and different kinds of inks to my watercolor. A few years back ago, I invested in an iMac for my classroom, and it's loaded with all of the Adobe Creative Cloud apps, including InDesign, Photoshop, Lightroom, probably about 30 or 40 different applications. And my students are allowed to use Photoshop, and they use it to edit their paintings and store in a file for their electronic portfolios. This last fall, we invested in a HP color laser printer, and it makes really nice reproductions. We put the students' work into matte frames and sleeves, and they can take them with us to our art shows throughout the county. For the mixing step in the vocabulary, I'm going to omit that step because to me that's a huge waste of paint, and I'm using Daniel Smith at about $21 a tube, so I think I'm going to pass on that. The transparent and opaque steps in the vocabulary are demonstrated in painting the actual iceberg. Okay, so let's move on to the masking fluid. For the latex masking fluid, I'm going to paint a color over it, and you can see that the color only goes around where there is no masking fluid. Again, you'd want this to dry overnight thoroughly before you remove that masking fluid, because when it's wet and you start to lift the masking fluid, it's like rubber. You're going to take part of the paper with it. You don't want that to happen. Okay, I also poured out some liquid wax, and you can hardly see it other than the reflection from the light above. And I don't use it like this. I usually pour it into one of these types of puddles, as I've demonstrated. But if I left this to dry, it would have the same effect or create the same effect as the latex, except for you couldn't remove it. It's not removable. Okay, real quick, I want to make sure that I explained some of the watercolor brushes. When we take workshops or give workshops, we only use 4 brushes, and one of the most important ones is the one I was using earlier, the mop brush. It's this one right here. So beginner sets are okay, but you're not going to get every single perfect brush in a beginner set that does a variety of different things. So we can get into that later. In the meantime, I have another wax here that is a clear crayon. So you can either get it in liquid like I demonstrated earlier, or use wax resist sticks that are like a crayon. This little piece here is a cut up debit card, and we cut them up and we recycle them and use them for creating texture on watercolor paper. So that's kind of a fun thing to do. I can demonstrate that at a later time as well. And I failed to put the paper towels in the video, so here we go. I use paper towels the same way as you saw earlier when I was taking my mop brush and wiping it against a cloth. So either is fine, you know, whatever your preference is. If you don't have one, maybe you have the other. At the conclusion of this unit, each student was issued a sticky note and asked to write what stuck with them today during the lesson.